My guest today is Mitchell Sorkin. He's the founder of ATM business.
Hey, Nick. How are you? Thank you for having me on.
That's good. So I was reading your Twitter, and you said that 2 years ago you left a VC-backed sexy startup to build a basic so-called boring ATM business. And within 1 year, you went from 3 ATMs to 100 plus, which did over 200,000 in revenue. And in 2023, you had a goal to 3x that and to do 700,000 plus revenue, hundreds of thousands of transactions. So it's August now. How is the business going?
It's going very well. We have two big transactions that I thought we were going to close on, I want to say 4 months ago, but everything takes much longer than you expect. I do still think we're going to hit our target of 700K in revenue this year, but I think we could have surpassed that if we had gotten these deals done sooner. But overall, things are going very well. I'm learning a lot, trying to talk to as many sellers as possible and just keep the ball rolling.
Okay, let's start with you sharing your background. I mean, sharing everything what happened after you graduated from university, for example.
Sure. I can even rewind a little bit more than that to give a little bit of context. I grew up in a family of Russian immigrants in the US, and my family came here and spent the first couple of years learning English, went out and got higher education degrees. My mother became a statistician, my father became an engineer, and nobody in my family really had any entrepreneurial DNA. And for whatever reason, I realized at a very early age that I really enjoyed selling things. And so I was kind of the black sheep in the family. And I, throughout high school, did a bunch of, small kid business type things. I sold water bottles. I bought and sold phones on Craigslist. And over time, I started to try to develop those things into actual businesses. So in university, I was introduced to Alibaba. I started sourcing products from China, white labeling them, selling them on Amazon, building small private e-com sites. I ended up going out to China to do some manufacturing work out there. We built a product from scratch, and I ended up in an IP lawsuit and lost that entire business over the span of a few months. So I slowly over time started to get very enchanted with internet businesses, whether it was software or e-com. And after our e-commerce business fell apart, I started a company that was a B2B service for Amazon merchants. So my co-founder and I started a company called Stack Influence. We bootstrapped it for about 4.5 years, got it up to $1 million in revenue, and then we went out and started raising money from VCs. And this was back in the boom where you could go on Clubhouse and raise $1 million in 30 seconds. And so we were fortunate to be in that era of fundraising. So we raised some money, and I pretty quickly realized that I did not enjoy the venture model, did not want to endlessly cycle through raising money in an effort to make a big bet into the future. And for me personally, I realized that I wanted to kind of take a step back, go back to basics, and just build a business that was profitable from day one. And so they're still doing very well, growing. I actually, after stepping down from management, ended up investing in them. They're some of my best friends, and I really believe in the product there. It just was not for me. And so in 2020, my brother and I decided we wanted to buy a small business. I went on Twitter. I started reading about ETA and search, trying to soak up some information on that in that space. And then we started looking at deals on BizBuySell, and we were pretty agnostic as to what we were looking for. We just kind of wanted to cycle through deals and get a feel for the process of actually talking to sellers and understanding how the whole process works. And that's kind of, before I share too much without giving you a chance to ask another question, I guess that's like, the lead up to how we got to where we are today.
Okay. So, I mean, there are thousands of different opportunities, niches to pursue. What inspired you to focus on buying and managing ATM machines specifically?
Yeah, so in the beginning, we didn't have a clear idea of exactly what we wanted. What we did know is that we wanted to buy a company that was operationally light. And so what I mean by that is, if you go out and you buy a landscaping business, you have to manage hundreds of landscapers. There's a foreman. You have to understand all the licenses for the equipment. We wanted to avoid that as much as possible. So my brother and I both have a knack for managing capital. So we wanted to stick to businesses that are largely, cash based. And I don't mean cash like actual 20s in the ATM. That happened later. But we wanted something that that had basically something that was less labor intense and more capital intense. And so we looked at vending routes. We were actually very close to buying a vending business. And then at the very last minute, we had a little bit of a disagreement with the seller, and it just gave us a bad feeling about the deal. And so we backed out of it. But I can't say we knew from the start that we wanted to be in ATMs. I think after the vending business deal fell through, we saw an ATM deal pop up, and that was actually not the one that we bought, but we started to get a feel for what the financials look like, and it looked very attractive to us. And after speaking to the seller of that deal, we realized that ATMs were probably better than vending for us, because vending, not that there's anything wrong with that business, but you have to store food, you have to keep track of expiration dates. It's a lot more complex in terms of managing your inventory. You have to stock vans. And so we realized pretty quickly that we'd rather avoid that and just, deal with one SKU, which is cash. And so, yeah, that's how we thought about it in the beginning. And once we purchased our first 3 machines and ran them for 4 or 5 weeks, I think we very quickly realized that this is the business we wanted to be in. It was very, very simple, straightforward. We enjoyed the fact that the machines were very easy to fix. So in the first 3 weeks, we had an issue with one of the machines. I looked up a video on YouTube and went there and fixed it myself. And it became very clear early on that the whole process is very simple. And so I don't mean that scaling the business to very large numbers is simple, but the actual mechanics of each machine. So that's how we were thinking about it.
You mentioned that the people who are managing vending machines, they have to store food, and in your case, it's storing money, storing cash. How does it all work? You have X amount of ATM machines. How does the business all work? The back end of it.
First of all, there's a big distinction between what is called vaulting in-house versus outsourcing the vaulting. So there are 2 ways that you can run an ATM business. You can order cash. You can have a contract between your bank and an armored truck service that will deliver cash to you, or you can go pick it up. And so every day or every other day, however you plan your cash loading, you put in an order for, let's say, $50,000 or $100,000 in $20 bills. You go and pick it up the next day. You give it to your loaders, or you yourself, if you're working in the business, you drive around and load the cash. And usually, I won't speak for all ATM operators, but for the vast majority that I've spoken to, you order some number of cash and you go and you load all of it, right? So you don't usually store cash in a vault. That doesn't make much sense, because you want the cash to either be sitting in the machines working for you, or it should be on the way back into your account. So there's no reason to withdraw $400,000 and put it in your closet and just pull from there. So usually all of your cash is at work at all times. So that's the first way that you can run the business. The other way that you can run the business, which is what most people do once they cross a certain threshold, let's say 200 or 300 machines, it becomes very difficult to drive around and load that many machines yourself. So what most people do is they outsource the vaulting, and you can outsource the vaulting to a few different third parties. The main one is armored trucks. So there's a very big company called Brinks in the US. Actually, I think they're global. And there are tons of other armored truck companies that are very similar. And what they do is they drive around and load your machines for you. Similarly to the first version of what I explained, which is where you have the bank send the money to the armored truck and you come to pick it up. Instead, the bank sends the money to the armored truck and they just go and load for you. That's the first way. And the second way is you can outsource your vaulting to other ATM operators. So, for example, we do this for other ATM operators in our area. If I have 10 machines in one neighborhood and you have 15 machines right next to mine, you can say, Mitchell, would you like to load my machines with your money? And I will pay you $1 per transaction. So this is a very common setup in the ATM business. So you can outsource the vaulting to either armored trucks or other ATM guys. And when you do that, you get rid of the cash risk. You don't have to load the machines. You just pay out $1 per transaction, kind of remove that entire operational headache.
When we take an extremely busy location, let's say there is a music festival really close to your ATM machines, and what you do when it's 1 a.m. and the machine doesn't have any more cash? What do you do?
Well, in an ideal world, you never let the machine run out of cash. The good thing about ATMs is that they're very predictable on average. So if you look at the historical data of a machine and you see that it dispenses, let's say, $20,000 per month, and you look a little bit closer and you see that occasionally it will dispense 25,000 or 15,000. It's going to be very difficult for that machine to randomly exceed either of those bounds. And so the situation you're describing does occur, and there's really not much you can do about it. You're just going to lose out on some small number of transactions, and you may have a store owner that's a little bit annoyed with you, but it's manageable. You're not gonna wake up at 1 a.m. and drive to go put $8,000 in a machine because it ran out. Really, what you end up doing is, if you know, like in your example, there's a music festival there, you know it's going to be busier than normal. You just cushion the machine by adding an extra $4,000 or $5,000 or whatever.
You mentioned the Brinks being the armor truck company, but what about the ATM machines? How did you find the right partner? I mean, not the business partner, which is your brother, but which type of company products you're using when it comes to ATM machines, and how to find the right one, which has the best machines.
So there are two main manufacturers of ATMs, Gen Mega and Hyosung. There are a few others that basically nobody uses. So these two players kind of dominate the market. As far as which one's better, my personal opinion is that it's questionable that either of them are better. I think they both work very well. Some people prefer Gen Mega, other people prefer Hyosung. But the good thing is that the parts are very much interchangeable with a few exceptions. But for example, you can take a dispenser, the actual unit that spits out the cash, and you can use it on either machine. There are some exceptions, but that makes it very easy for you to say, oh, I have 300 machines, 200 of them are Hyosung, but I bought this route that has a bunch of Gen Mega machines. Something went down over here. I can take a part from here. So my personal opinion is that you should just focus on having machines that work well and not think too much about the brand. Some people like to have one route that is all one type of machine. And I think there's some good logic there, but I'm not going to buy a route of 100 machines that are all Gen Mega and then replace them with Hyosungs just so that my entire route has one type of machine. That doesn't make sense to me financially, but hopefully that answers your question.
The size of your business, you mentioned if everything goes well, it's going to be 700,000 revenue this year. What level are we talking about? Like how many ATM machines in your portfolio at the moment?
So at the moment, as we're speaking right now, before we close on these two deals, we have 143 machines. After we close on these two deals, we will have over 700, but there's again a big distinction between there's kind of two camps in the ATM business, which the first one is machines that you own and load yourself or own and outsource the loading. and there are processing only locations. And what processing only means is that, I don't know if you know about interchange. Have you heard of interchange?
Nope.
Okay. So whatever transaction occurs, there's an additional form of revenue that is called interchange, which is paid out to the processors from the banks. And we don't need to go like too deep into the weeds of this because they make it quite confusing, and it's also, doesn't really add anything to the conversation for us. But let's just say on average, the interchange that's paid out is somewhere in the range of 30 cents. That's pretty close per transaction. So customer comes up, swipes their card, they withdraw $100, they pay a $3 fee to the ATM operator, and then there's this extra 30 cents that occurs on the back end. And whoever is processing that transaction will take a piece of that 30 cents, and the processor will then forward back the rest of that interchange to the ATM operator. And if you have 5 machines, your processor will tell you, Mick, you don't have any leverage, you have 5 machines, we're going to take all of that 30 cents and you're not going to get any interchange. And as you start to grow, you can negotiate more and more of that back to you. And so what decides how much of the interchange you get is called a buy rate. And so, for example, if your buy rate is 10 cents, you get that 30 cents, they take 10 cents, that's your buy rate, and you get the 20 cents back. That's how interchange income works.
You mentioned if everything goes well, you're going from 140 machines to 700. But who is the biggest player on your market, in your city, in US?
There are a few very big players. One of the biggest is Cardtronics. Another is PAI. PAI is actually our processor. And PAI was purchased by Brinks for $215 or $220 million a couple years ago. Obviously, there's a lot of synergy between PAI and Brinks, so it was kind of like a strategic buy on Brinks' side. These guys have somewhere in the range of 100,000 machines each. And going back to what I was talking about during the interchange portion of our conversation just now, a ton of those machines are processing only locations, right? So the 140 locations that I have that are on PAI, they consider that in their portfolio of 100,000 locations. They consider that, part of their portfolio. But I keep all of the surcharge. I keep a decent amount of the interchange off of that. And so they are just basically taking the delta between the total interchange paid out and how much they give me. And so going back to when I said we were going to grow from 140 locations to 700, a big part of that portfolio will be processing only. And so it seems like a giant leap to go from 140 to 700 locations. But the actual locations that we're going to add that are owned and loaded by us will be around 250 machines. So still a big jump, but sounds a lot bigger than it is.
How has the ATM industry evolved over the years? And I mean the competition, because now as I was reading about ATM business in general, Googling it, I keep seeing the advertisements on social media, people selling me a course on how to buy an ATM machine and how to operate this business. How does this affect you, or what do you see going on the market?
It doesn't really affect me very much because my strategy is very different than the strategy that they are selling. So, you can take 2 paths in the ATM business. One is the bootstrapping path, where you're going to actually walk around and walk into stores and try to place machines one by one. The reality is that ATMs have been around for a very long time. Most of the best locations are taken. It's a very competitive market. Trying to bootstrap and do outside sales and place machines one by one is a very long and tedious process. And unless you build out some sort of really robust sales infrastructure where you have guys going out in the field and working commission only, I think it's going to be very difficult to build a large business that way. My strategy is to find sellers and buy existing ATM businesses. I'm looking at historical transaction data. I can see that these locations are good and have been good for a very long time. I'm not trying to play a guessing game of placing machines in locations. But to your point about courses, yes, there's a lot of that out there. It's kind of a predatory business. And if you look, if you even spend 10 minutes looking at some of these courses, I mean, almost all of that information that they're giving to you, I give away for free on Twitter all the time. I mean, it's not very complicated. And most of those courses, what they do is they offer you some set of information and they say, we're going to give you this entire, playbook, and then we're going to sell you one machine in one location for $10,000 or $15,000. From a math standpoint, it's really, really bad. I've tweeted about this before. I think people should really avoid those communities as much as possible. And I don't want to bash any of them individually because I don't know, but I've seen some stuff that's very questionable, and so I would avoid it.
Yeah, because some of the ideas, what they were selling, were that instead of acquiring a real estate, just one apartment in the beginning, you should buy a vending machine. Sorry, not vending machine, ATM machine, because it's a much better business. And this was the idea I saw many times when reading their sales pitch.
Yeah, I think like any good shady pitch, any good snake oil salesman, there's a little bit of truth in there that they're warping. And it is true that if you buy an ATM machine and find a good location, I mean, if you get lucky, you can place a machine in a location and it will generate $400, $500 a month. You bought the machine for $2,500. You load it with like maybe $4,000. I mean, you're making 50, 60, 70, 80% a year on that one machine. That's amazing. That's better than real estate. But the reality is that that's not going to happen very often. They are not going to give you one of those locations when you pay them for their course. And so, that's the reality there.
So you're saying you're playing a bigger game, playing the game using capital. How do you find the sellers? How is this process?
So in the beginning, it was all listed, all stuff that I found on BizBuySell. We would go on some independent brokerage sites. There is quite a large ATM site, ATM route site called atmbrokerage.com. So I looked on there a lot in the beginning. I've gone to all of the industry conferences. There's a conference called NAC. There's one ATMIA. I went to another conference in Vegas, which was for amusements. So like all of the arcade games that you see, the basketball shooting game. And there was a section of that conference dedicated to ATMs. So going to all of these conferences, shaking hands, meeting people, over time, you start to build more and more of a network. I've now had people that I've met at those conferences think of me because when I go and meet people, I tell them I'm aggressively buying routes. I'm trying to find as many deals as possible. And so maybe one of their friends decides that they want to sell their ATM business and they say, oh, I remember that guy that I met at the conference. So I've had people bring deals to me. I've had some stuff that I found on Twitter now that I've gotten some just distribution there. I'm just trying to get the snowball rolling as much as possible, talk to as many people as possible. And
talking about the current portfolio of 140-ish machines, how is your current day look like?
Well, most of my time nowadays is spent trying to raise money. My brother handles most of the ops. We've outsourced 75% of our loading, cash loading of the machines. Most of my time is spent on investor calls, trying to put out content, working the digital side of the business. I don't really do a ton inside of the business. So I think that was a lot less true 8 months ago. 8 months ago, before I had any traction on Twitter, I was, spending most of my time working in the business, not on it.
And honestly speaking, how is it going when it comes to raising capital? Asking because it's another completely different industry. For example, we're raising money for buy now, pay later company. Then we're raising capital for boring manufacturing businesses. Then I have a friend who raises money for his venture capital fund. And it's really, really tough for each of those industries. But what about you?
Well, I would be lying if I said it was easy. It's definitely a challenge, but I think I think we're in a very interesting point in time right now where a lot of people, a lot of high net worth people have been very overexposed to tech for a very long time. We went through a 15-year bull market. A lot of these people, thanks to Twitter, I think, have started to really become interested in boring cash flowing businesses and stuff that just prints money. Has it been easy? No. But as I've gained more and more credibility on Twitter, and as I've taken checks from people and we've had a good relationship for 6, 8 months, a year, those people start to introduce you to others. And again, it's just a network effect thing. So it's been interesting. We've tried to raise mostly debt, and for obvious reasons, selling equity in the ATM business is very expensive. And so if I could just raise $50 million in debt, I would love to do that. The reality is that most people on Twitter want more meat on the bone, I guess you could say. And so it's been interesting. It's been a learning process. It's completely different from raising for tech, as you just said. It's different in all of these industries. I think the advantage that we have is that we have a very strong story, or maybe not very, but we have a fairly strong story. And I've been able to tell that story on Twitter, get inbound leads, get on calls, and just form relationships over the internet, which I've been shocked by. I really can't believe the position that we're in now versus where we were a year ago. I think Twitter really changed the trajectory for us big time. So,
Lead wise, and what has changed when we take last year August and now this year August, like lead wise, for example?
On the capital side?
Yes.
Well, last August, I was reaching out to people in my network that I had just met over the years in business and doing a little bit of family and friends fundraising. And to be honest with you, I didn't really have access to much capital at all. I think last August we may have raised 50 to 100 grand. So it was a struggle. I didn't really have any sort of distribution. I didn't have access to capital networks outside of the people that I knew. What has changed is that nowadays I get emails, I get inbound DMs on Twitter. Whenever I post a thread or a tweet that does well, I get some handful of people that are interested. I have become friends with some people who have newsletters on Twitter that have, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 high net worth individuals. And so occasionally I'll send out a newsletter through them and get a bunch of inbound leads. And so I've also done a little bit of outbound outreach, which I think I should probably be doing more of. But yeah, I think everything has changed. It's completely different now than it was a year ago.
Good job. Congratulations. It's really awesome to hear that.
Thank you.
And now a little bit about the challenges. What are the biggest challenges in this business?
I would say one of the biggest challenges is that in the beginning, you don't know anyone in the business, and ATM operators are very much elusive, very insular on average. It can be very difficult to get people to help you with things that go wrong, or getting access to, going back to what we spoke about 15 minutes ago, outsourcing vaulting to other ATM operators in the beginning is nearly impossible. Well, I'd say the big challenge in the beginning was getting that process started of shaking hands and starting to meet people in the business that could help you when things go wrong or bring new opportunities to you. So that's why I spent the vast majority of my time in the beginning networking very aggressively. And I think that worked wonders for us, because we bought a route 5 months ago in the middle of the country. I was able to find people to vault it for me. When things go wrong, I know technicians in that area, so I can just send an email and have somebody go fix a machine for me. I flew out there and spent 4 days transferring over the machines and meeting these people in person. And I left, and I've never been back since. And I think it would be very difficult to do that if you don't spend a ton of time trying to meet as many people as possible in the business. And so that was one big challenge. Another big challenge is that banks do not really want to do business with ATM operators in the United States. So banking can be a huge challenge, which only matters if you're going to be loading the machines yourself. If you outsource the vaulting, that's somebody else's issue now. But we went through quite a nightmare scenario in the beginning when we were loading our own machines. We had an existing relationship with Bank of America, and we opened up a business banking account there, and we thought that we would be able to run our ATM business through them. And a few months in, we got a letter saying that your account has been shut down and we've made a business decision to no longer work with you. And you have 60 days to find a new bank. And so that was very stressful, trying to scramble to find a new bank to take our business. And so that's not unique to us. Anybody who's been in the ATM business for a few years will tell you that that's just a very common occurrence. And so banking is a big challenge. I think there's also a big challenge around the business itself. To people outside of it seems very gray area, I guess you could say. People don't really understand the whole process of driving around with cash and loading. It all seems very dangerous. They don't understand that you can outsource that. And so it can be difficult to explain to investors sometimes. Yeah, just the education around the actual ops of the business can be a challenge as well.
What other risks there are? I mean, you mentioned the bank. How do you handle the issues like technical side, someone breaks the machine, the cash management in your business when you said you're just driving around through the city and putting 4,000 into one machine, 4,000 into another? What are the risks in there, or what have you experienced?
So there are quite a few risks. I guess I'll run through them one by one. If you are loading yourself or you have employees loading your own cash, there's the obvious risk of being robbed. There is some protection around that. You can get what's called cash in transit insurance. And so if your employee steals the money or if your employee is robbed, that is covered. You can also insure the machines themselves and the cash inside of them. That's quite expensive, and from our perspective, it makes sense to just self-insure that. But if your employee is driving around with $100,000 and they get robbed, you don't really want to be self-insuring that unless you have a gigantic business and you just don't mind losing $100,000 here and there. That's the majority of the risk on that side. The other risk is machines being broken into. So, again, you can self-insure against that because unless you're very small, it's okay to very occasionally lose a machine and $2,000 or $4,000 inside of it. It shouldn't destroy your business unless you only have 4 machines. I'd say in the past year, we've had 2 machines stolen. It just, it doesn't affect the bottom line too much. We just basically bake it into the P&L. We say, we're going to expect 2 or 3% of gross to go to theft every year. The other risks largely are kind of like macroeconomic risks. So what's going to happen to cash over time? Are you buying at a multiple that is going to not make as much sense 2 years from now? We can't really predict the future. And so that stuff is kind of out of our hands. But I'd say that's the majority of the risk. As far as machines breaking, again, we just bake that into the P&L. So anywhere between 2 and 3% of gross, I think, is a good estimate for what your maintenance CapEx is going to be. And obviously that depends on how good or bad the equipment is. So if you buy a route of very old machines, the equipment's very bad, you're probably going to spend more than 2 to 3% of gross on that. But if you have a route of all brand new machines, it's going to be less than 1% of gross that you'll spend. So yeah, I think 2 to 3% is a good estimate.
Are all your machines profitable?
Yes, with the exception of maybe one or two. We've purchased routes where the seller says, "Hey, there's these two machines. They're horrible. They do like 3 transactions per month, but you have to take them in order to get the rest of these." And so think we have, I think we have two locations that make maybe like $9 a month or $15 a month. And obviously, that's not profitable. You have to pay $5 for Wi-Fi. You have to send your employee there occasionally. So it's probably break even, or maybe you lose $10 a month on it or whatever. But we just use the location as storage basically for that machine. And whenever a new opportunity pops up, we just come, we pick up the machine and put it into a better location. And so I'd say 99% of ATM locations are profitable. It's very difficult for them not to be.
And how often do you change the locations? And how often do you look for new locations?
In the beginning, when I had less to do, I spent a good amount of time going out and looking for new locations, and we did place probably 10 or 15 machines into new locations. But nowadays, I don't really spend much time on that at all. And the only time we move machines is when a business shuts down and they tell us, "Hey, sorry, you have to come pick up the machine." Occasionally, they will sell the location to somebody else, and that person wants to put their own machine, or they have a friend in the ATM business and they want to kick you out for whatever reason. So, to answer your question, I would say it's pretty rare that we move machines around. Most of the time, they just stay where they are.
When it comes to generating revenue, I mean, the main thing is obviously per each transactions, you're getting $3, $4, less than that, more than that. But are there any like innovative strategies or value-added services you could offer to add another streams of revenue? I mean, maybe putting some type of ads on the machines when it's a busy location, or how does it work?
There are a few different things you can do that we admittedly have not done yet. So one is that you can go around to small banks and credit unions and tell them, if you put your decal, you put your advertisement on our ATM, we will give all of your customers free surcharge so they can withdraw, up to $200 for free from our machine. And in exchange, I want you to pay me $500 a month or $400 a month, whatever. You can negotiate it. And so I've heard of people doing this, but usually it's at bigger accounts. So somebody will have 3 machines in an airport, for example. They'll go to a local credit union and they'll say, 100,000 people per month are going to be walking past this machine. I want you to pay me $2,000 a month or $5,000 a month, and I'll give all of your customers free surcharge. You'll have the advertisement there. So that can be very profitable. It's just something that we don't have accounts where that makes a ton of sense. I don't have any casinos or strip clubs or airports, like very, very high volume locations. And so it's going to be a little bit of a tougher sell to say, "Hey, I have a liquor store and there's 2,000 people a month that walk by it." I think I think I could potentially do that. I think there are better uses of my time. There's some stuff that's built into the software on the machine, so you can do value added services that again are built in. Like there's a thing called DCC, dynamic currency conversion. So if somebody comes, for example, from Europe and they have a European debit card, there's basically a program that will give you additional income there when they swipe. There's Bitcoin software that's built into all of the machines, so you can program that if you'd like. Some people use it and say it generates a little bit of extra income. For us personally, it doesn't really make sense so far because the areas that our machines are in, from my perspective, are not very Bitcoin adept, I guess you could say. You also have all of these relationships with these store owners, so you could potentially try to put other machines in there. I know some people put Bitcoin machines, and that's separate from what I just explained, which you can actually program Bitcoin transactions into the existing ATM machine. But some people put full Bitcoin machines in. Some people try to get credit card processing accounts, so actual credit card terminals. That's very, very profitable, and I've tried it, but it's a highly competitive market, and the level of trust between merchants and credit card processors is nearly zero. These people have had horrible experiences. They get signed into these like draconian contracts. And so I have not had much luck getting those accounts. It's very easy to get tempted in this business and have shiny object syndrome or whatever you want to call it. Whenever you read advice from very successful people, they usually tell you just focus on one thing, continue to just hammer that one nail. I'm trying as much as possible to just do one thing, which is raise money, buy ATM routes, optimize them, raise more money, buy ATM routes. And so,
what do you see as the future of the ATM industry, considering the rise of digital payments and changing customer behaviors?
So I'll start by saying that I think it would be silly of me to say that the industry is not declining. I think for sure 20, 30, 40 years from now, ATMs will be in a very different place. But the reality is that the world moves very slowly. And if you look at some other industries that went through technological disruption, the main one being payphones. Payphones were a gigantic industry in the 80s and 90s. Cell phones started to go mainstream in the early 2000s. iPhone came out in 2006. If you look at the payphone industry 10 years after the iPhone came out, so you look at like 2015, 2016, your guess would be that payphones were gone, right? Completely obsolete. In 2016, or no, I think in 2015, payphones did $300 million in sales in the US. And you look at another one, fax machines. Email has been out for 50 years. You look at fax machines last year, they did nearly $1 billion in sales in 2022. And so when I think about ATMs from that perspective, and I understand the market that ATMs serve, and we can talk about that in a second, I start to realize that we're probably a bare minimum of 10 years out from ATMs being in a really bad spot, and it could be 15 to 20. When I see that these deals that we buy are returning 30, 35, 40, 50% cash on cash returns, what do I care about what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years? It just doesn't really matter to me. I'm not concerned about the short term at all. I think that ATMs will be completely fine in 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. And maybe the decay rate is 5% a year, or let's say it's even 10% a year. You just model out 10% a year, but you make 35 or 40% on what you're buying today, it's still a great buy. And so that's how I think about it.
But how big you think and want and believe you can build this business?
Very big, very big. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the SMB world, so it's still small to medium-sized business. I'm never going to build $1 billion company here, but in terms of income, it could be completely life-changing. I think we could. This is going to be a bold claim, but I think we could get to 10 million in EBITDA over the next 4 years or so. I do think that's doable, and so to me, that's very big. I mean, if you ask a tech company if that's big, they'll tell you that's a tiny company. But I think we could get there.
So can we say that this is the goal? End of 2028, the goal is to have $10 million EBITDA business.
Mark my words.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, a little bit for people who are maybe thinking of doing something similar, based on your experience, what advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs looking to enter the ATM business?
I think it largely depends on your constraints. And so I get this question a lot. I do a lot of free consultation calls on Twitter. People want to get into the business. They schedule a call with me and they ask me this question, what should I do if I want to get into the business? And I usually answer that question with a question, which is, what are your constraints? And so if you have a time constraint, meaning you have a full-time job, you have some capital set aside, I would focus on trying to find a very good deal and outsourcing the vaulting, because it's going to be very difficult for you to solve the problem of the banking side, getting all of that set up. Driving around and loading machines is going to feel foreign to you. It might feel risky. especially if you have a family. So if your constraint is time and you're a little bit risk averse, I would probably try to find a good deal and buy it. And on the other side, if you have a capital constraint, you don't have a lot of money to deploy into the business, then I would spend some time walking around, trying to find a location, speaking to store owners, understanding the sales process of actually placing machines in new locations, and try to build the business kind of brick by brick that way. And start it as a side hustle, get a little bit of additional income, and basically do exactly what these courses are trying to sell, except figure it out on your own, because you don't need to pay them $15,000 for one machine. You can buy a machine for $2,500. And I think once you ask yourself that question, what are my constraints and what am I trying to solve for, then you'll have a much clearer idea of how to enter the business.
So let's wrap up with a famous 5. How old are you?
31.
Favorite book?
Candide.
Married, single, kids?
Married in 3 weeks.
What car do you drive?
Honda Fit.
What's the best investment advice you've ever got?
Don't make speculative investments, I guess.
Perfect. Where can people find you?
Find me on Twitter at Mitchell_Sorkin. You can send me an email, info@sorkinatm.com. We're pretty quick to answer DMs and emails. So yeah, reach out there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mitchell. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate you having me on.